This is not some mystical theology, it's standard scientific assumption. Actually, it's derived from mystical theology in the first place, but most scientists, without necessarily knowing it, are subscribing to a worldview of an eternal present.
So, Rupert, Tim just mentioned something about retrocausality, and you've studied retrocausality. I don't know how much of it was a metaphor, but I'd like you to comment on that.
As purposive beings, like all animals and plants, we're shaped by future goals. We're goal-directed. So there's a sense in which all our actions are related to virtual futures. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead had a very interesting view of the relation of mind and body, which is relevant here. He thought our minds were concerned with possible actions. Our minds inhabit a realm of possible futures, and the main function of consciousness is to choose among those possible actions. So our minds inhabit this kind of future possibility, what we're going to do next, what we're going to say, where we're going to go, etc., which next event we're going to after this, all those kinds of things, how we're going to get home this evening. Our minds are full of and longer-term futures. But the physical causation that's working on us is coming from the past. Causation, as understood in physics and science, is flowing from the past through all the things that have happened, a kind of inertia from the past that's always influencing us in the present. Whitehead's point of view is that the relation between mind and body is not a spatial relationship within and outside. We usually think of it spatially, the inner life, the outer world, but a relation in time. The mental pole of our existence is the future pole, the physical pole is the past pole. And there's this kind of causation working from future goals, working on what we do in the present, which is, as it were, moving backwards in time, whereas physical causation is moving forwards in time, and they overlap in the present. So the present is that area where there's a merging or blending of these two currents of time, one physical, the other virtual, but both equally important in shaping what we do, insofar as we're autonomous and making decisions. So I think that there are ways in which there's also retrocausation, where we're connected with our future, particularly through precognitive dreams or through short-term presentiments, where there's a lot of evidence that, at least from time to time, most people can dream precognitive dreams, something that hasn't happened yet. There's also evidence from parapsychological research that people who undergo an emotional arousal, for example, by seeing a picture of an erotic or a particularly violent scene in computerized experiments, that their emotional arousal begins about 5 seconds before the event actually happens. There's a kind of bleeding back of influence from the future into the present, and that's called presentiment. And I think in nature, animals have this. I think the warnings that animals give of earthquakes and tsunamis, which I've been studying for 25 years, show that they can feel when something bad is about to happen, sometimes days in advance. So there are these connections across time. Everyone knows about memory and connections from the past. They're rarer, but there are connections from the future. But they can only work and act if they act in the present, where the future and the past, as it were, overlap.
I think that life is saying something true about the universe, which is that we live in a quantum theoretical universe. It's like life forms are a kind of giant lithograph of the truth of quantum theoretical things. And what does it mean? Well, in a certain way, at that scale, that very ground state, sort of quantum scale, time is kind of jiggling, right? It's only averaging out to forwards. It's actually jiggling backwards and forwards, right? And a life form, in a way, is chemistry having mercy on itself. Like the chemical refuses to. We live in a universe of revenge, mostly, right? Where this black hole just inevitably eats that planners, and this chemical automatically dissolves that thing. But this thing used to be a kind of baby version of this thing, kind of roughly, sort of comically, it maintained itself through quantum theoretical things that happened at many, many levels. And there are, of course, many quantum theoretical phenomena in life as such, right? Like when a photon enters a chloroplast, it goes into a superposition. Yeah, there are tiny quantum scale magnets in birds' eyes, so they do not have to be in an electromagnetic wave to feel the direction, right? I think this is because life is saying something true about our world, and namely, that the future can really be genuinely different from the past, right? We don't live in a tragedy, we're living in a kind of comedy, in a way. Chaplin said that tragedy is the close-up, comedy is the wide shot. Yeah. You can generate, theoretically, a quantum random number. This number cannot be predicted by any algorithm recipe, which is obviously based on the past, even if you were to run it for trillions of years longer than the expected time of the universe. Therefore, the future can be different. Yeah, this is very important, I think, for some people to know, like my kids. The future can be different from the past.
So, Rupert, you mentioned that when people meditate for sufficiently long or in the correct way, whatever that means, or take psychedelics, that sometimes they can reach states that are mystical or union-like, and that these are states of becoming. However, at the same time, we're talking about the present moment, and when people speak about the present moment, they speak as if it's a fixed object like a dot and not an arrow. So are you saying that what characterizes the present moment is more a process than a state?
Yes. I'm saying it's more a process than a thing. But I think when we have that sense of presence or connection and mystical experience, it's more an experience of being than becoming. It's an experience that we're actually being in the present. And most of our life is becoming, and most of nature is becoming. It's changing and going somewhere else from where it is at the moment. The whole universe is becoming. We're in an evolutionary universe that's been expanding since the moment of the Big Bang, according to our standard cosmogony. And so the becoming is the nature of nature, really. But all traditional mystical philosophies or religious philosophies would say that behind all this becoming, there is a conscious state of being, which is in the present, by definition, eternally in the present. Namely, when Moses asks the burning bush, the voice from the burning bush, "Who are you?" And God says, this first revelation of God's being directly by God, "I am who I am." That's sort of present being, conscious being in the present. And since God is usually conceived of as eternal, then there's a kind of eternal present underlying everything in the world of becoming. And some people interpret mystical experience as a momentary connection with that eternal present, which is by definition beyond becoming, because it's the ground and the source of everything that is and everything that is becoming and sustaining it. If you just take, if you don't like mystical ideas or talking about God, then you got it in conventional, hard-nosed, materialistic science too, because science is actually derived from a kind of Platonic philosophy or Pythagoreanism, where the eternal forms that shape what happens are beyond space and time. In Plato's philosophy and in Pythagoras' idea that there's an eternal mathematical realm that underlies everything that happens and changes in space and time. That's been inherited by modern science, and lots of debates about how are all the laws of nature fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. But the assumption of most scientists is that these laws are fixed. They're not things you encounter when you're exploring the world. These laws of nature are beyond space and time. They're present at all times and in all places. They're changeless, immutable. And this is not some mystical theology, it's standard scientific assumption. Actually, it's derived from mystical theology in the first place, but most scientists, without necessarily knowing it, are subscribing to a worldview of an eternal present through these generative forms that aren't the mathematical equations and the, as it were, the Platonic ideas that underlie the world of experience, the always changing world.
Yeah, there's so much to respond to on that. I mean, so I wrote down Kafka's alarm clock, everything grey is a cat, and the self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm going to try and deal with all of these briefly. So the first, I was thinking about Kafka's alarm clock. That's this, you may remember the beginning of the Metamorphosis, where Paul Gregor Samsa wakes and he's being transformed into a monstrous insect. And you could say this is 1915, it's kind of the worst moment for time, in the history of time, because what happens to Gregor Samsa, he's an insect, but he only realizes that things are wrong because his alarm clock hasn't woken him. He has this alarm clock by his bed, and it's a kind of novel device at the time. It's got a coil and a bell, and it hasn't woken him because he's slipped out of this mechanistic, symbolical order of clock time. Because he's been so alienated, we heard about alienation, he's been so crushed and alienated by this mechanistic beating of minutes and hours, tolling down his experience and diminishing him into this kind of being that must only be calibrated through the amount of time that he's been pushed into work and having to expend all his time in earning a living for his ungrateful family. And so he falls out of this symbolical order into this realm where he's seen as grotesque, and he can no longer hear the alarm clock. He says, how on earth he thinks to himself, how didn't I hear this ghastly noise? And it's right by my head. And this is such an important moment if you think about our relationship to time and alienation and modernism and a lot of what's being spoken about here, because you're pre the acceptance or the general knowledge of Einstein's theories. Obviously 1905 he writes the first big paper, but it's before it's really come into the public consciousness. And you've just had 2 centuries of more and more mechanization. If you look at in the 18th century, if you were walking to meet your friend in a village and you were running late and you haven't got a clock because you're not carrying one around with you as we all are now, and instead you're looking for a sign of time, and you look at the church clock, and until the 18th century it may not even have a face. It certainly doesn't have a minute hand, it just has a rough sense of the hour, but it may just be chiming. And so you're living in a completely different relationship to this symbolical order that's restricting you and containing you all the time and asking you to perceive your mortal span in these tiny, tiny fixed increments that must be monetized, must be calibrated. And so I think Gregor Samsa is really interesting because he's right in the depths of that. He's right in the middle before the quantum stuff really kicks off and it gets far more fun again for time. And we can start talking about notions of the future influencing the present. Well, I was thinking it was so interesting when both Rupert and Timothy were talking about this sense of the future influencing us and also us creating the future. So there's this sense of the self-fulfilling prophecy is the old cliche, but there's also this sense of metaphor, that we live in these metaphors that we build. And if we build a particular metaphor that then we kind of move along with, we then draw everything into it. And potentially we draw the future because we see the aspects of our experience and of reality that correlate with this metaphor. So we kind of drive into the future and we select from possibility. And you can see that often with predictions of political crises, where you could potentially argue you can cause a crisis by predicting it, but then you want to be ready. So are you going to fulfill your prophecy or not? And in terms of the cat, I have a very foolish cat that tries to kill everybody. It's grey, and it's always trying to kill you by standing at your feet and killing you as you fall over it. And so it means that in order not to die at the hands or paws of a cat that didn't mean to kill you, you end up seeing every single greyish object in the house as a cat. Every single thing. And maybe it's hanging off the door, it's sort of under a chair, it's kind of sitting on the counter, because there's some process by which you're trying to anticipate the disaster, which is your cat accidentally kills you. And you're now rendering this entire reality where everything grey is a cat, which is quite nice in a way, but there's something odd and interesting to me going on about the way then again we're creating a sort of metaphorical landscape to try to prevent the thing that we've predicted, which is death by cat. So I think that's most of what I was thinking about while my brilliant colleagues were talking.